Chapter 3 is all about cells. And so in this lesson, we're going to take a little look at the history of the discovery of cells and then the two main types of cells, either prokaryotes or eukaryotes. So cells are the basic functional units of living things. It's the smallest unit that can carry out any of the biochemical reactions for life. All cells have the same basic parts and processes. So in this image here, each one of these sections is a cell. And in these cells, we have in the middle here, those would be the nucleus or the control center of the cells. And in the next video, we'll spend a lot of time talking about different cell parts. So the discovery of cells, they were first discovered in the mid-1600s. And then about 200 years later, we had enough information to develop a theory about cells. So the earliest observations of cells came from Robert Hooke. So he was the first scientist to discover cells. And he was from Britain. So in 1665, he was studying living things under a microscope, and he looked at a piece of cork, and cork comes from trees. And he saw the tiny compartments or rooms, and he decided to call them cells. And then a little bit later, in the late 1600s, a Dutch scientist by the name of Anton van Leeuwenhoek, he was a lens crafter, and he made a stronger microscope than what Robert Hooke had. And so he used his now stronger microscope to discover cells from other organisms. He looked at human blood cells and bacteria. So early in the 1800s, every organism that had been examined was realized to have contained cells. So two German scientists, Theodor Schwann and Matthias Schleiden, came to two major conclusions. And the first one was that cells are living, and the second was that all living things are made up of cells. And these 2 points right here are the start of the cell theory. So in 1850, Rudolf Virchow, a German doctor, observes living cells under a microscope, which is kind of obvious because you can really only see them under a microscope. But what he saw them dividing. This was the first time that cells had been seen dividing. And so he added a third piece to that cell theory and said that living cells produce new living cells by dividing. And so that's what's happening up here in this first cell, is that this cell is dividing. You can see it's starting to pinch in, and it'll eventually pinch in the whole way so that this becomes one cell and this second is the second cell. So putting them all together, we have the cell theory, which states it's a theory that all organisms consist of one or more cells. So here's that first one. Then it says that cells are alive and the site of all life processes. And finally, it says that all cells come from pre-existing cells. So there's really 3 parts to this cell theory. So all cells have some similar structures. It doesn't matter if they're prokaryotes or eukaryotes. They all have these structures. So the first structure is a cell membrane. And this is a thin coat of phospholipids that surrounds the cell. It's kind of like the cell's skin. It's the physical boundary between the inside of the cell and the outside environment. Its job is to control what enters or leaves the cell. So we call that in science its function. Another name for the cell membrane is the plasma membrane. All cells have cytoplasm, and this just refers to any of the material inside the cell membrane. One of the main components of cytoplasm is a watery substance called cytosol. And so this is what holds the structures in place. The cytoplasm will include all other cell structures, and they'll be suspended in the cytosol. So the cytosol isn't like liquidy water, it's more of like a jello type structure or consistency. All cells have a nucleic acid. Usually it's DNA, and this contains the genetic instructions that cells need to make proteins. So we have the cell membrane as the first structure they all have, then the cytoplasm, then DNA, and our fourth structure are ribosomes. Ribosomes are structures where proteins are made, and ribosomes are made up of RNA particles and proteins. So, like I said, there are two main types of cells. We have prokaryotes and eukaryotes. And the big difference between prokaryotes and eukaryotes is the presence of something we call the nucleus. The nucleus is a structure that's enclosed by a membrane, and it contains most of the cell's DNA. These cells are classified based on whether or not they have a nucleus. So if you do not have a nucleus, so no nucleus, are prokaryote cells. The DNA just floats freely in the cytoplasm. And there are domains of bacteria and archaea that are prokaryotes. Prokaryotes are organisms then with prokaryotic cells. These are single-celled organisms, and they were the first type of organisms to evolve in Earth's history. Today, there is more prokaryotes than any other organism on the Earth. So here's an image of a simple prokaryote cell. Things to notice is that this red blob of like spaghetti noodle mess in the middle, that's the DNA, and we call it a nucleoid because it's not in a nucleus. On the outside, you'll notice these green spiky things. Those are called pili, and they help prokaryotes move. Same with this flagella. Flagellum help bacteria move. Then the red outline is the capsule, the yellow is the cell wall, and then the green is the plasma membrane. All three of these help the prokaryotes keep their shape and protect them. The blue in the middle is the cytoplasm with that cytosol. And then we have ribosomes and something called a plasmid also in that cytoplasm. So the ribosomes make that protein. And the plasmids are random chunks of DNA that are floating around in that cytoplasm. So plasmids are DNA. Eukaryote cells are cells that do have a nucleus. And they're larger and more complex than prokaryotes. Eukaryotes are things that have eukaryotic cells, and they belong to domain eukarya. Eukaryotes include anything from protists to fungi to plants to animals, and most eukaryote organisms are multicellular, meaning they have more than one cell. So as you can see from this image that eukaryote cells are much more complex. They have many more structures within them, and their DNA is located here in this nucleus. So the DNA, let's change colors here. The DNA is in the nucleus, and this whole structure right here is the nucleus. It's usually one of the larger structures in eukaryote cells. In the next video, we'll take a look at each of these other structures, so I'm not going to get into them today. So eukaryote cells have all those other structures inside the cell, and we call those organelles. Each organelle has a specific job, much like your organs in your body have a specific job. Like your heart's job is to pump blood, your lungs help you breathe. They all have that specific job. This allows eukaryotic cells to carry out more functions than prokaryote cells. So, in these multicellular organisms, most of the cells are what we call specialized cells, and these are cells with special jobs. Generally speaking, the shape of their cells help them do their jobs the best. So nerve cells, that's right up here, their job is to send messages. And so they have all these spindly, like fingers coming off their cells. So they can send messages in many different directions at one time. Red blood cells, their job is to carry oxygen, or one of their jobs. And so it kind of looks like an inner tube because the oxygen molecules will actually bond into the middle there. Sperm cells are needed to swim, and so they've got these really long tails on them. Lastly, we have these pollen cells. Pollen needs to stick to pollinators, so they have all these spiky structures to help them cling to the pollinators. So whatever the job of these cells, they have a shape that suits the job. Organisms will get classified or organized based on how complex they are. So some organisms are only as complex as the tissue level, meaning they only have groups of cells of the same kind that perform the same function. Then we have some organisms that are a little bit more complex, where they have organs, and those are composed of two or more types of tissues that work together to do a specific task. And then even some organisms are further complex because they have organ systems, and this is a group of organs that work together to do the job. And then finally, an organ system can make an organism. So if we look at examples here, jellyfish are only organized to the tissue level. That means they don't have organs and they don't have organ systems. They just have different kinds of tissues that have different jobs. So they have digestive tissue, and they also have nerve tissue that senses their environment. And the digestive tissue has a job of digesting their food, and the nerve tissue has the job of sensing the environment. Then there's organisms that just have organs, and then those that have organ systems would be like us humans. We have like our digestive system and our nervous system, because we have multiple organs in each of these that work together in order for us to function. So if we look at this from all the way at the smallest piece, the atom, atoms make compounds or molecules. These compounds or molecules make organelles. These organelles make cells. Groups of cells make tissues. Groups of tissues make organs. Groups of organs make organ systems. And groups of organ systems can make organisms. So then the next piece about cells to talk about is why they're so small. They're so small that their diameter is measured in a unit we call micrometers. And so this is 1/1,000,000th of a meter. And the reason they're so small is because cells have to pass substances into and out of the cell. They need to take in the nutrients and pass out the waste products. And this all has to happen through the cell membrane. So as the cell gets bigger, it's going to need more nutrients and it's going to create more waste. And so it's much harder once a cell gets big to get the waste out of the cell as quickly as it needs to, because there's more distance for it to travel. So if the volume of a cell becomes too great, it won't have enough surface area to transfer all the nutrients and the wastes. So cells have to be tiny so that it can effectively take in nutrients as much as it needs and then get rid of as much waste as it needs to.